governance, because we accept the state and the responsibility of institutions, but I want to put out a charge to civil society organizations. I want to ask you to become a little uncivil. Some of you are very entangled with political parties. I know you've been doing good work. I want to encourage you, for example, to engage in mentorship programs in our prisons. The boys on the blocks. Yesterday we heard Dr. Didika's Jews speak to us about that syndrome we have, where we tend to believe that the boys on the blocks, we need to take the negative energy, he said, and turn it into productive use. I am saying that in the midst of their criminality, many of them are searching for security. And we have to find a way to mentor, to go into our communities and find leaders who can take this Caribbean forward. I remember during the period of the Grenada Revolution, we had parish and zonal councils, and people's democracy was very important. And I want to again throw out a call to Caribbean people to form yourselves and organize and mobilize in your communities. This is where governance begins. Caribbean families and societies produce Caribbean leadership. So before we could even speak about political leadership, we have to understand that we need community leadership. We need to harness young leaders in our communities and ensure that we have the framework necessary to push governance. Now, I want to get to the political, because the political is the elephant in the room. And I want us to move beyond a politics of survivability to a politics for sustainability. Because we do not have a politics for sustainability. And we have been using very nice diplomatic language when we all know that Caribbean political life is broken. Many of you are facing elections, whether it's in Trinidad or Guyana, and you are not sure whether you are voting. Why? What type of society produces the type of political leadership that we have? I want us to imagine a future far from where we are, and then we work ourselves backward. Can we imagine a Caribbean society without political parties? Can we? Can we be bold in our imagination? Can we imagine governments of national unity, where the Sustainable Development Agenda is not held hostage to the political cycle, where partisan politics does not continue to undermine our search for sustainable development? I want to see a new kind of politics in the Caribbean. Every unborn Caribbean child must never inherit the political systems that we have today. And I'm not saying that we have failed states. We have formal democracy. We have relatively well-functioning state institutions. But what we don't have is substantive democracy. We have unhealthy democratic forms because our political culture is such that there's an interplay of insecurities within the governance architecture that we have. So I am making a call for a CARICOM Commission on Governance and Security as a tangible recommendation from this panel. A CARICOM Commission on Governance and Security that has as part of its mandate solid, tangible recommendations to address the unhealthy democratic practices we have in this Caribbean. Now, when we speak about governance and security, we have in the Caribbean something that works well. There is a regional security infrastructure that I think works. One more minute when I'm finishing. We have impacts. I would want to see impacts and the RSS become one institution, even as we have the Caribbean Climate Change Center in Belize and other regional institutions that make up the Caribbean regional security infrastructure. We need to strengthen that because I think that is the shining pillar in Caribbean integration. And I will stop here. There's so much more that I need to say, but that's all I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Don't let us constrain you. There is Twitter, there is the website. You can continue your recommendations online.
Thank you.
Lino, can I invite you, as Dr. Grand did, to boil your thoughts down to some tangible recommendations on how we go forward?
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to focus on small states mostly, and on examining the situation here, one finds that there is a lot of difference between these states. Some are growing fast, some are stagnating, some depend on commodities, like we heard from Suriname, some depend on services, some are progressive in their views, some regressive. However, there is one common feature. They are all very vulnerable. They are very exposed to shocks. So what happens internally is not always self-inflicted. We have the high debt ratios here, partly because of loose fiscal arrangements, but partly because of the exposure that these countries suffer from. So if there are countries that need to be well governed, if there are countries that need to be resilient, these are the small countries. They are the ones that are exposed very highly to factors outside their control, and that requires what we call resilience, which is the ability to withstand such shocks. And resilience requires good governance. Now, when I looked at the governance indicators for the Caribbean, I found that the major weakness is in economic governance. Instability arising from high debt ratios, also current account deficits. So I think there is a resilience weakness in this region. And I'm going to propose that the governance approach here should be based on RAP, to remember R and P, resilience and proactiveness. And I really enjoyed, just half an hour ago, the speech by the professor here, where he insisted on the proactivity requirements of planning. So I'm going to refer to these two factors. Firstly, I'd like to refer to the question of resilience, and this has to come at the regional level. Institutions for resilience are not cheap. There is a need for a competition authority, regulatory frameworks, whatever. And because of the problem of indivisibility, that is very high overhead costs, which can be shared at the region, that will put in place the required institutions for resilience. And there should also be a region-wide governance. I mean, the region, it's a little bit like the EU, where the governance is set by the region, by the EU in general, and the countries have to obey. Now, this requires renouncing of some sovereignty. Are the countries in the region prepared to renounce some sovereignty in order to have a region-wide governance structure? I think this is one of the questions that has to be answered. If the answer is no, you won't have regional integration. At the moment, regional integration here is very poor, as I see it. And if one wants really to engage in this type of integration, some form of sovereignty has to be lost. Now, the other point which I'd like to insist upon is proactiveness. Now, when a country is proactive, it has to identify sectors that have matured, or sectors that are dying, or sectors that are likely to mature, and identify new ones. The country where I come from, Malta that is, which is quite successful, has all the time engaged in this exercise. At the moment, for example, e-gaming is very important. It's a very large sector in Malta. The government has already identified that it's going to die. Other countries have prepared legislation to compete with Malta, so it is a maturing sector. It's going to decline, so let's think of new ones. So the proactivity proposal made by the professor, I think should really be taken very seriously. Also, the other point is identifying where labor, which is knowledge-based, is needed. Now, knowledge-based labor has the characteristic of generating more income per hour. That's the difference between non-knowledge-based labor and knowledge-based labor. And there is a possibility in small states, which Singapore has done, Malta has done, of what we call vertical specialization. You specialize in an area which is knowledge-based. Like, for example, in semiconductors in Malta, where there's a very small section of the value-added range, which is done by very skilled technicians and engineers. And every hour that they work generate much more income than the workers engaged in construction, workers engaged in producing clothing. So that is an area that will generate wealth in a country. And I think one should look at the example of the successful small countries. I'm going to mention Iceland, Malta, Singapore. They all have a large private sector. So this type of proactivity should be based on the private sector. And I've heard more than once here in the Caribbean, people saying there's no room for the private sector because we are small. It's not true. Iceland, with only 300,000 people, have a relatively large private sector. Singapore is driven by the private sector. So I think that type of proactivity of giving more space to the private sector is a very important option for the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lino. Dr. Ram, can I invite you to share your recommendations?
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Well, I've been asked to come here this afternoon to discuss with you a very loaded topic: have Caribbean growth strategies failed? I guess we're all here because we do believe that they have, but I would just want to say that I think that the strategies that the Caribbean pursued initially after the period of independence certainly were successful at that time. The Caribbean region has achieved many social gains, and the economic growth that we had initially in the 70s and 80s were pretty good. However, I would like to say that the strategies that we followed is almost as if you're in a carnival fete, and the DJ has continued to play the same tune over and over.